Tonight, we invite you to find a comfortable position, to let the weight of the day fall away, and to allow your mind to drift gently back in time. There is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Simply allow the sound of my voice to be a quiet guide, a soft current in the river of history, carrying you toward restful sleep. Our journey tonight takes us to a place of great complexity, a time of profound change and unsettling ambition. We will be exploring the life of a woman who stood at the very center of a tumultuous and dark chapter in world history. Her name was Magda Goebbels, but we will not begin with the storms and the shadows. Instead, our story starts quietly in a world of elegance and aspiration, in a time before the world knew what was to come. We will trace the soft footsteps of a young girl, navigate the hushed corridors of wealth and privilege, and witness the careful construction of a life that would become inextricably linked with power and ideology. There is no need to grapple with the difficult questions tonight. Simply let the details wash over you. The descriptions of rooms, the textures of fabric, the quiet rhythm of a life unfolding. This is not a story of drama, but of detail. It is a slow, measured walk through the past, designed to quiet the mind and invite tranquility. So take a slow, deep breath, let it out gently, and let us begin our journey in the elegant, hopeful, and complicated world of early 20th century Germany. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps our small community of quiet history lovers grow more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so feel free to drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see our global community connecting through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet, unassuming arrival. Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl was born on the 11th of November 1901 in Berlin. The city itself was a tapestry of old and new, a place where the grandeur of the German Empire met the hum of modern industry. Horse-drawn carriages still shared the cobblestone streets with sputtering new automobiles, and the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, damp earth from the Tiergarten, and the promise of a new century. Magda, as she would come to be known, entered a world of domestic complexity. Her parents, Oskar Ritschl, an engineer, and Augusta Behrendt, had married shortly before her birth, but their union was not destined to last. They separated when Magda was only a few years old, a quiet tearing of the fabric of her earliest life. Her mother, Augusta, soon found love again with a Jewish industrialist named Richard Friedlander, who had a factory in Brussels. The family moved there, and Friedlander would become a loving and influential stepfather to the young Magda. It was his name she would carry for many years of her childhood. Imagine, for a moment, the world through the eyes of this young girl. She spent her formative years in Brussels, a city of ornate guild halls and quiet, dignified parks. Life with her mother and stepfather was comfortable, secure, and steeped in the values of the successful bourgeoisie. Richard Friedlander provided a life of material comfort and stability. He adored Magda, and in these early years her life was one of gentle privilege. She would have known the soft rustle of fine dresses, the quiet clink of porcelain at the dinner table, and the ordered, predictable rhythm of a well-to-do household. Her education was a reflection of these aspirations. She was sent to the Sacré-Cœur Convent School in Vilvoorde, a town just outside Brussels. Here, amidst the quiet devotion and strict discipline of the nuns, she was immersed in a world of refinement. The curriculum would have focused on languages, deportment, music, and the arts, the essential toolkit for a young woman destined for a good marriage and a life in high society. She learned to carry herself with grace, to speak French fluently, to appreciate the finer points of culture. The air in the convent would have been cool and still, smelling faintly of floor wax and old stone. The days would have been marked by the ringing of bells, the soft murmur of prayers, and the focused, quiet work of the classroom. It was here that a fascination with appearance, with elegance, and with the serene confidence of the upper classes began to take root in her young mind. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 shattered this idyllic world. As a German citizen living in Belgium, a country invaded by Germany, her position became untenable. The family was forced to flee, returning to the relative safety of Berlin. This sudden dislocation was a stark contrast to the ordered stability of her life in Brussels. Berlin during the war was a city of tension and scarcity. The vibrant promise of 1901 had given way to the grim realities of conflict. Food was rationed, the streets were filled with wounded soldiers, and a constant, low hum of anxiety replaced the confident energy of the pre-war years. For Magda, now a teenager, this return to Berlin marked a significant shift. She continued her education at a high school, but the world around her was one of austerity and uncertainty. The quiet, refined atmosphere of the convent was replaced by the much harsher reality of a nation at war. It was during these years that the contrast between the life she had known and the struggles she now witnessed would have been deeply imprinted upon her. The desire for security, for the comfort and elegance that had been so abruptly interrupted, likely became a powerful driving force. After the war, as Germany transitioned into the turbulent era of the Weimar Republic, Magda's life took another turn. She was a young woman now, poised and intelligent, with a cultivated grace that made her stand out. It was on a train that she had a chance encounter that would forever alter the course of her life. The man she met was Günther Quandt, one of the wealthiest and most powerful industrialists in all of Germany. Quandt was a widower, significantly older than Magda, and a man of immense stature in the business world. He had built a colossal industrial empire that included textiles, batteries, and armaments. He was the personification of German industry, sober, powerful, and unimaginably rich. Quandt was immediately captivated by the beautiful, intelligent young woman. He saw in her a polish and sophistication that he felt was missing from his own life. A life that had been dedicated almost entirely to business and the accumulation of wealth. For Magda, Quandt represented everything she had been taught to aspire to. He was security, status, and a gateway to the highest echelons of society. Their courtship was swift, and in 1921, at the age of 19, Magda Ritschl became Magda Quandt. Her marriage to Günther Quandt plunged her into a world of almost unimaginable luxury. Imagine yourself stepping into one of the Quandt residences. The silence is the first thing you notice, a deep, plush quiet that absorbs all sound. The air is warm, scented with fresh flowers, and the faint aroma of beeswax from the polished wood floors. Light streams through tall windows, illuminating rooms filled with heavy, dark furniture, priceless carpets, and walls adorned with masterwork paintings. A retinue of silent, efficient staff moves through the house, their presence felt only in the perfect arrangement of objects, the immaculate cleanliness, and the seamless service at mealtimes. Magda's days took on a new, unhurried rhythm. Her primary role was to be the perfect hostess, the elegant chatelaine of the Quandt estate. Her days were no longer her own, but were instead structured around the demands of this new position. A typical day might begin with a consultation with the head housekeeper, discussing menus for the evening's dinner party or the floral arrangements for the grand salon. The afternoon might be spent at fittings for new gowns with Berlin's most exclusive couturiers, or perhaps attending a charity luncheon with the wives of other industrialists and bankers. Evenings were a blur of social engagements, dinners, receptions, and box seats at the opera. This was the glittering high society of the Weimar Republic's golden 20s. On the surface, it was a world of exuberant creativity, intellectual ferment, and lavish parties. Berlin was the cultural capital of Europe, a place of artistic innovation and daring social change. But beneath this glittering facade, the nation was grappling with the humiliation of its defeat in the war, crippling economic instability, and deep political divisions. For the elite in Magda's circle, however, this turmoil often felt very far away. Their lives were insulated by fortunes so vast they were almost abstract. They moved between their city mansions, their country estates, and their holiday villas, their world a protected bubble of extreme privilege. For Magda, this was an education of a different kind. She learned the subtle language of power, the unspoken rules of high society. She observed how men like her husband moved through the world, their decisions shaping the national economy, their influence felt in the halls of government. She mastered the art of conversation, of being charming and engaging without ever being controversial. She learned to manage a large household, to oversee staff, and to project an image of effortless grace and unassailable social standing. In November of 1921, less than a year after her marriage, Magda gave birth to her first child, a son named Harold. Motherhood, within this context, was a structured and somewhat distant affair. A nanny and a governess would have been responsible for the day-to-day care of the infant. Magda would have been the serene, beautifully dressed mother who visited the nursery at appointed times. Her presence a calming and elegant feature in her son's life, but not the constant hands-on presence of a mother of lesser means. Harold's arrival solidified Magda's position in the Quandt dynasty. He was the heir, The continuation of the family line and his birth was a significant event. Yet, despite the immense wealth and the outward appearance of a perfect life, the marriage between Magda and Günther Quandt was not a union of passion. Quandt was a demanding and emotionally reserved man, dedicated to his work above all else. Magda, young and intellectually curious, found the rigid, formal life of the Quandt household to be stifling. The endless social engagements began to feel repetitive, the conversations shallow. She had reached the pinnacle of the social world she had once dreamed of, only to find the air at the top to be thin and unsatisfying. The quiet, ordered rhythm of her life began to feel less like a gentle current and more like a gilded cage. A subtle restlessness began to stir within her, a quiet yearning for something more than just comfort and security, a desire for purpose, for an idea to believe in. It was this quiet dissatisfaction, born amidst the greatest of luxuries, that would eventually lead her down a path that no one, least of all herself, could have ever imagined. The gilded cage of Magda's life with Günther Quandt, with its silent servants and predictable, luxurious rhythm, had begun to feel less like a haven and more like a beautifully appointed prison for the mind. A quiet but persistent restlessness had taken root in her. She possessed wealth, social standing, and security, yet she felt a profound lack of purpose. It was this internal void, this search for something to believe in, that made her receptive to the powerful new currents of political thought that were sweeping across the fractured landscape of the Weimar Republic. Germany in the late 1920s was a society of extremes. The glittering, decadent culture of Berlin stood in stark contrast to the very real suffering and economic anxiety felt by millions. The nation was a cauldron of competing ideologies, with political parties from the far left to the far right shouting their promises and solutions into the chaotic public square. It was a time of fervent debate, of street rallies, of whispered conspiracies, and of a deep, collective yearning for a clear path forward, for a strong hand to calm the storm. Out of intellectual curiosity, and perhaps a desire to escape the staid conversations of her husband's social circle, Magda began to attend political meetings. Imagine her, dressed in the understated elegance that was her signature, slipping into the back of a smoky, crowded hall. It was at one such gathering, a rally for the burgeoning National Socialist German Workers' Party, that she first encountered Joseph Goebbels. He was not a man of conventional good looks or imposing physical stature. He was slight of build, with a sharp, intelligent face and a noticeable limp. But when he spoke, the room fell silent. He was the party's Gauleiter, or regional leader, for Berlin, a gifted and fiery orator. For a mind like Magda's, accustomed to the dry, pragmatic talk of industrialists, Goebbels' rhetoric was something entirely new. He did not speak of profit margins or market shares. He spoke of destiny, of national pride, of sacrifice, and of a revitalized Germany rising from the ashes of its defeat. He painted a vivid picture of heroes and villains, offering simple, powerful answers to the nation's complex and painful questions. For someone adrift in a sea of purposeless privilege, this unwavering conviction was magnetic. Their meeting was the spark that ignited the dry tinder of her dissatisfaction. They began to talk, and she found in him an intellectual equal with a shared passion for ideas. He was drawn to her poise, her intelligence, and the powerful social connections she represented. A relationship began to form, a meeting not just of personal attraction, but of ideological alignment. This new connection offered everything her current life lacked: a sense of mission, intellectual excitement, and a feeling of being at the very center of a movement that promised to reshape the world. The quiet, ordered world of her marriage to Günther Quandt could not survive this new, powerful force. The union was dissolved. The divorce was a quiet, civilized affair, a legal transaction that formally ended one chapter of her life as another was beginning. In the settlement, Quandt, perhaps out of a lingering affection or a desire to avoid a scandal, was remarkably generous. Magda was left a wealthy woman in her own right, free to pursue her new path. She did so with total commitment. She formally joined the Nazi Party and for a time worked in its headquarters. Picture her, the former Frau Quandt, accustomed to a life of leisure, now in a modest office, surrounded by the scent of ink and cheap paper, the clatter of typewriters a constant hum. She dedicated her time to organizing Goebbels' private papers, a quiet, meticulous task that placed her at the very heart of the party's propaganda machine. It was an apprenticeship in the mechanics of power, a world away from the opera boxes and grand salons she had once inhabited. Her relationship with Joseph Goebbels deepened, and by 1931 they resolved to marry. Their wedding, however, was to be no simple private ceremony. It was a calculated political event, a piece of living propaganda. The ceremony took place at a country estate, one that had, with some irony, been provided by her ex-husband Günther Quandt. The guest list was small and exclusive, composed of the highest-ranking members of the Nazi Party. And the most important guest, the one who served as the chief witness, was Adolf Hitler himself. Imagine the scene, a crisp winter day in the German countryside. The atmosphere is not one of joyous romantic celebration, but of sober, ideological purpose. Hitler's presence lent the proceedings a solemn, almost religious gravity. He saw in Magda the personification of the ideal German woman. Beautiful, cultured, elegant, and now utterly devoted to the cause. Her marriage to his most loyal and brilliant propagandist was a powerful symbol. It represented the union of the party's revolutionary energy with the legitimacy and refinement of the old upper classes. It was a signal that the Nazi movement was not just for the disaffected masses, but could also attract the best and brightest of society. Hitler's quiet approval, his role as a witness, sanctified the marriage, elevating it from a personal union to an act of service to the movement. With this marriage, Magda's transformation was complete. She was no longer Magda Quandt, the restless socialite. She was now Magda Goebbels, a central figure in the rising Nazi elite. As the Nazis seized power in 1933, she and her husband were catapulted into the absolute center of power. Joseph Goebbels was appointed Minister of Propaganda, one of the most powerful positions in the new state, and Magda's role became just as crucial, albeit unofficial. She was often referred to as the First Lady of the Third Reich. Her life became a carefully curated performance of this role. Their home in Berlin became a second court, a place for hosting dinners and receptions for foreign dignitaries, military leaders, and artists who were favorable to the regime. Magda, with the effortless grace she had perfected in her first marriage, was the perfect hostess. She would guide conversations, charm powerful men, and project an image of sophisticated, serene domesticity that stood at the heart of the new Germany. A unique and close relationship formed between Magda and Adolf Hitler. He was a frequent visitor to the Goebbels home, finding in their family life a respite from the pressures of his political duties. He was enchanted by Magda. They would spend quiet evenings together, listening to his favorite classical music, discussing German culture, and watching films. He saw her not just as the wife of his minister, but as a confidant and a living embodiment of his feminine ideal. In the Goebbels children, who soon began to arrive, he saw the future of the nation he was building. This idyllic family life became a cornerstone of her husband's propaganda efforts. Imagine the photographs and newsreel footage that were distributed across Germany and the world. Here is Magda, smiling, surrounded by her brood of beautiful blonde-haired children. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Heike. They are pictured in sun-dappled gardens, dressed in pristine matching outfits, the very image of health, happiness, and Aryan perfection. Here is Magda, walking with Hitler, looking up at him with an expression of serene devotion. Each image was meticulously crafted. Each smile, each gesture was designed to sell a powerful idea: that the Nazi state was a protector of the family, that life under its rule was wholesome and prosperous, and that its leaders were not ruthless politicians, but benevolent father figures. Behind this carefully constructed public facade, life was one of immense and ever-growing privilege. The family lived in opulent homes, staffed by a legion of servants, gardeners, and cooks. They had access to the best of everything, even as the nation was being placed on a wartime footing, and ordinary Germans were being asked to tighten their belts. They had a private cinema, a fleet of chauffeur-driven cars, and vacationed in exclusive villas. The rhythm of Magda's life was once again one of comfort and luxury, but this time, it was a luxury born not of industry, but of political power. It was a privilege directly tied to the ideology she had embraced, a material reward for her devotion. This life of curated perfection, of public symbolism and private opulence, was built on the foundations of her husband's powerful position. And that position, in turn, gave them access to a vast and dark river of resources, the origins of which were becoming increasingly disturbing. The life of serene, ideological purpose that Magda Goebbels had embraced came with rewards that were anything but abstract. The power she and her husband now wielded was not just a tool for reshaping a nation. It was a key that unlocked a treasury of immense material wealth and privilege. Her first marriage had given her a taste of luxury, a foundation of personal wealth that provided a certain independence. But the resources now at her disposal were of a different order entirely, flowing not from private industry, but from the deep, dark coffers of the state itself. Let us quietly unpack the sources of this extraordinary affluence. A portion of it was, of course, official. As a Reich minister, Joseph Goebbels received a substantial salary. But this formal income was merely the visible tip of a vast iceberg of privilege. The Nazi state operated as a system of patronage, rewarding its most loyal servants with benefits that placed them far beyond the concerns of ordinary citizens. They were granted lavish housing, unlimited expense accounts, and access to goods and services that were simply unavailable to the general public. This was a system designed to bind the elite to the regime, to ensure their loyalty by wedding their personal fortunes to the success of the party. Imagine for a moment their primary residence in the heart of Berlin. It was not a house, but a sprawling, opulent apartment overlooking a quiet square, its windows gazing out over the city that was the center of their power. Step inside, and you would once again be enveloped in that familiar silence of the very wealthy. The air is still and warm, carrying the faint, pleasant scent of leather-bound books and polished wood. The rooms are vast, with high ceilings and walls covered in silk damask. Heavy velvet curtains muffle the sounds of the city below. The furniture is a collection of priceless antiques and elegant modern pieces, arranged with a decorator's perfect eye. There are, of course, servants, a butler, cooks, maids, a chauffeur, all moving with a quiet efficiency that renders them almost invisible. Their presence is a constant, silent testament to the status of the occupants. Even more magnificent was their villa, a grand estate on the island of Schwanenwerder, a secluded, wooded enclave in a lake just outside Berlin. This island was an exclusive colony for the Nazi elite, a place where the powerful could retreat from the pressures of the capital. The Goebbels' villa was a palatial structure, its white walls gleaming amidst acres of meticulously manicured gardens that sloped gently down to the water's edge. Here, there was a private dock for their yacht, tennis courts, and paths that wound through the quiet woods. It was a self-contained world of leisure and luxury, a fortress of privilege where the grim realities facing the rest of Germany seemed a world away. This is where the children spent much of their time, raised in an environment of idyllic, manufactured perfection, shielded from all hardship. But the beautiful objects that filled these homes, the exquisite porcelain, the heavy silver cutlery, the grand piano in the music room, the paintings by old masters that lined the walls, had histories. And this is where the river of wealth that sustained the Goebbels family takes its darkest turn. A significant portion of their luxury was not bought, but acquired. It was the direct result of a systematic and cruelly efficient policy known as Aryanization. In the calm, bureaucratic language of the regime, Aryanization was the process of transferring Jewish-owned assets into German hands. In reality, it was organized plunder on a national scale. Beginning in 1933, Jewish citizens were systematically stripped of their livelihoods, their businesses, and their property. A Jewish family who owned a successful department store would be forced to sell it to a German buyer for a fraction of its true value. A Jewish doctor would have his practice confiscated. And, most relevant to our story, Jewish families who had lived for generations in beautiful, well-appointed homes were evicted, forced to leave everything behind. These homes, suddenly and violently emptied of their rightful owners, were then made available to high-ranking Nazi officials. The Goebbels family, like many others in the party elite, benefited directly from this state-sponsored theft. They moved into homes or were given furniture, art, and jewelry that had been confiscated from families who were, at that very moment, being herded into ghettos or deported to concentration camps. Imagine for a moment Magda Goebbels walking through her drawing room. Her hand might trail across the smooth, cool marble of a mantelpiece that had, only months before, held the family photographs of another woman. She might sit down at a beautifully inlaid desk to write a letter, using stationery found in one of the drawers. The piano on which her children learned their scales may have once been played by a family whose music had been permanently silenced. The quiet history of these objects was a constant, unspoken presence in the house. The luxury that surrounded her was haunted by the ghosts of its previous owners. the beauty was inextricably linked to an immense and terrible sorrow. This was not the clean wealth of industry her first husband had built. This was the wealth of dispossession. As the war began and progressed, the chasm between the lives of the Nazi elite and the German people grew into an impassable gulf. While ordinary German housewives contended with strict rationing and stood in long lines for basic necessities, Magda's kitchens remained fully stocked. While the sons of Germany were dying on the frozen plains of Russia, her son, Harold, from her first marriage, served in the Luftwaffe, but her younger children remained safe within their protected bubble. They had access to luxury goods, French silks, perfumes, and fine wines that were plundered from the newly occupied territories of Europe. When the Allied bombing raids began to hammer Berlin, reducing vast swathes of the city to rubble, the Goebbels family and their inner circle were largely insulated from the danger. They had access to deeply excavated, specially reinforced private bunkers. While the citizens of Berlin huddled in crowded, terrifying public shelters, the Goebbels could retreat to their own subterranean world, a space designed to allow their life of comfort to continue, even as the world above was being systematically destroyed. Here they could watch movies in their private cinema, enjoy well-cooked meals, and maintain the illusion of normalcy. Life during the war for Magda was a series of exclusive gatherings, quiet dinners, and carefully managed public appearances. She was a constant presence at Hitler's side, a symbol of serene, unwavering loyalty. Her world remained one of order and privilege, a small, brightly lit island in an ever-widening sea of darkness, chaos, and suffering. Her children were kept oblivious, their days filled with lessons, games, and the gentle rhythm of a life untouched by the shortages and fears that defined existence for millions of other German children. But this entire edifice of plundered luxury and protected privilege was built on a foundation that was beginning to crumble. The wealth, the power, the security, it was all contingent on the survival of the regime that provided it. By late 1944 and early 1945, the war was hopelessly lost. The armies of the Soviet Union were closing in from the east, and the Allied forces were advancing from the west. The supply lines that brought luxuries from occupied Europe were severed. The bombs were falling closer and more frequently. The quiet, manicured world of Schwanenwerder was no longer a safe haven. The illusion of a 1,000-year Reich was evaporating day by day, and with it, the very basis of Magda Goebbels' existence. The life she had so carefully constructed, a life of ambition, ideology, and borrowed luxury, was about to face its final, terrible reckoning. Not in a grand villa, but deep beneath the burning streets of a dying city. The gleaming white villa on Schwanenwerder, with its manicured lawns and quiet lakeside views, had long been a symbol of untouchable serenity. It was a world hermetically sealed against the hardships of the nation, a place where the children's laughter was the loudest sound, and the only conflicts were those played out on the tennis court. But by 1943, the war, once a distant affair of glorious newsreels and maps with advancing pins, began to send its first chilling whispers across the water. The fortress of privilege was beginning to show the faintest of cracks. This shift was not sudden. It was a slow creeping erosion of normalcy, a gradual change in the atmosphere. It began perhaps with the sound. For the first time, the distant, mournful wail of air raid sirens in Berlin could be heard from the island. At first, it was a faint curiosity, a sound from another world. But soon, it became a regular feature of the nights, a somber undertone to the quiet rustling of the trees. The city, which had for so long been the source of their power and entertainment, was now a source of a low, persistent thrum of violence. On clear nights, the residents of the island could see a faint, flickering orange glow on the horizon, a silent, terrible aurora that was the reflection of a burning capital. Life for Magda had to continue its performance of serene domesticity. The propaganda machine she and her husband so expertly managed demanded it. The newsreels still needed their footage of the happy, healthy Goebbels children, picking flowers in the garden or playing with their pets, a living testament to the wholesome future the Reich was supposedly building. Magda still hosted gatherings, her smile as poised as ever, her conversations as cultured. But beneath this placid surface, a new tension was palpable. Imagine a dinner party at the villa in late 1943. The long table is still perfectly set with heavy silver and glistening crystal. The food, while perhaps not as ostentatiously lavish as in the early years, is still plentiful. But the conversation is different. The talk is no longer of inevitable victory and the spoils that will follow. It is now of strategic withdrawals, of wonder weapons that are always just on the cusp of being developed, of the need for the German people to show resilience and sacrifice. The faces around the table, the faces of the Nazi elite, are a little more strained, the smiles a little more forced. And every so often, the distant, percussive rumble of the bombs falling on Berlin will cause a momentary pause in the conversation, a flicker of shared anxiety in their eyes before the performance of confidence is resumed. For Magda, the primary duty was to shield her children from this encroaching reality. Their world was to remain a world of innocence. But even the thickest walls of privilege cannot keep everything out. The children would ask about the strange noises at night. They would notice the worried expressions on the faces of the staff. Magda would have to find calm, reassuring answers. She would explain the sounds as something distant and unimportant, a necessary part of the final push for the victory that was always just around the corner. She became the curator of her children's reality, a task that required constant vigilance and a profound level of self-deception. Her public role also intensified. As the war turned decisively against Germany, Joseph Goebbels delivered his infamous Total War speech at the Berlin Sportpalast in February 1943. He called upon the German people to accept total mobilization, to embrace extreme austerity and sacrifice for the war effort. Magda was seated in a place of honor, her face a mask of solemn patriotic agreement. She was the model German woman, ready to sacrifice for the fatherland. Yet the word sacrifice had a different meaning for her than for the women in the audience. Her sacrifices did not involve queuing for bread or sending a husband to the front with no certainty of his return. Her sacrifice was the emotional labor of maintaining the facade, of projecting strength and serenity while living in the very heart of a failing regime. The contrast between her protected life and the lives of ordinary Germans became a chasm. While other mothers worried about feeding their children on dwindling rations, Magda's household still had access to special stores. While other women saw their homes reduced to piles of brick and dust, Magda had a reinforced, state-of-the-art bunker just steps from her villa, and another, even deeper one, waiting for her in the center of Berlin. Let us imagine a descent into this private shelter during a raid. The heavy steel door closes with a solid, definitive thud, sealing out the world above. Down a flight of concrete steps, the air becomes cool and still. The rooms are utilitarian but comfortable. There are beds with clean linens, a pantry stocked with food, a generator that provides steady electric light. It is a world away from the crowded, damp and terrifying public shelters where thousands of Berliners huddled together in the dark, listening to the world being torn apart above them. Here, in the Goebbels' shelter, the children could be given a warm drink and told a story. The terror of the raid was reduced to a muffled, abstract vibration felt through the soles of their feet. It was a sanitized, manageable version of fear. As 1944 bled into 1945, this sanitized existence became harder to maintain. The Red Army was closing in from the east, a relentless tide of vengeance. The Allied armies were pushing in from the west. Germany was being squeezed into a smaller and smaller space. The destruction of Berlin was no longer a distant glow on the horizon. It was a daily, devastating reality. Entire districts were erased. The city was becoming a lunar landscape of skeletal ruins and rubble-choked streets. The infrastructure of the state, once so ruthlessly efficient, was beginning to collapse. The beautiful villa on Schwanenwerder, once a symbol of power, now felt isolated and exposed. The war was coming to them. The final desperate defense of the capital was being prepared. For the leaders of the Reich, there was only one place left to go, a place deep underground, a concrete tomb that would serve as the final stage for the drama of the regime's collapse. In the final weeks of April 1945, the decision was made. It was time to abandon the increasingly vulnerable island villa. It was time to move into the very heart of the citadel, into the Führer bunker, the vast subterranean complex beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. This was not a move of strategic relocation, but an act of ultimate retreat. It was an admission that the world above ground, the world they had sought to dominate, was now lost to them. For Magda Goebbels, this meant making a choice. She could have taken her children and attempted to flee to the Bavarian Alps, where other high-ranking Nazis were preparing to make a last stand. She had the means, the connections, but to her, such an act would have been a betrayal of everything she had staked her life on. Her loyalty was absolute. Her fate was tied to that of Hitler and her husband. And so, she prepared her 6 children for one last journey, not to a holiday villa, but to a concrete labyrinth from which there would be no escape. The slow, creeping dread had ended. The final act was about to begin. The journey from the island of Schwanenwerder to the Reich Chancellery in the center of Berlin was a passage from one reality to another. It was a short distance in miles, but an immeasurable chasm in experience. The children, bundled into the car, may have seen it as just another drive, perhaps a little more hurried than usual. But for Magda, looking through the thick glass of the limousine, it was a journey through the ruins of the world she had helped to create. Imagine the sights that flickered past the window. The familiar, elegant avenues of West Berlin were gone, replaced by canyons of rubble. The skeletal remains of grand apartment buildings stood like blackened teeth against a grey, smoke-filled sky. The air itself was different, thick with the acrid smell of burnt stone, dust, and a faint metallic tang of decay. The smooth ride of the limousine was frequently interrupted by jolts and swerves as the chauffeur navigated around debris and bomb craters. What was once a vibrant, orderly metropolis was now a landscape of profound and shocking destruction, the cacophony of the approaching battle a constant rumbling soundtrack. The vehicle finally pulled into the battered courtyard of the Reich Chancellery. This once imposing symbol of Nazi power was now a scarred and pitted shell. Soldiers and frantic officials hurried across the grounds, their movements imbued with a desperate, chaotic energy. There was no grand arrival. The Goebbels family was quickly ushered towards an inconspicuous camouflaged entrance, a concrete blockhouse that led down into the earth. This was the entrance to the bunker. To descend its stairs was to leave the sun, the sky, and the living world behind. With each step down, the air grew cooler and damper. The sounds of the battle outside became muffled, replaced by a new set of noises. The monotonous, life-support hum of the ventilation system and the low, steady throb of a diesel generator. It was the sound of a machine keeping a handful of people alive while the world above them died. They entered a world of concrete and steel. The Führerbunker was not a palace. It was a functional, subterranean fortress, a warren of narrow corridors and small, Spartan rooms. The light was artificial, a harsh, unblinking glare from bare electric bulbs that banished all sense of day or night. Time itself seemed to dissolve, measured only by the changing of the guard, the serving of meager meals, and the relentless, grim-faced meetings of the men who still believed they were in command of armies that no longer existed. The Goebbels family was assigned a small suite of rooms in the upper part of the complex, the Vorbunker. These rooms were tiny, damp, and sparsely furnished with simple beds and wooden cupboards. For a family accustomed to the sprawling luxury of their villa, it was a profound change. Their entire existence was now compressed into a space smaller than the grand salon they had left behind. Magda's primary task in this concrete ark was the continuation of her life's most challenging performance, that of the calm, reassuring mother. She had to create a bubble of normalcy for her children in the most abnormal place on earth. She explained to them that they were in a special, wonderful shelter, a place where they would be safe from the naughty uncles, the Allied soldiers, who were making so much noise outside. The bunker became, in their minds, a strange and exciting playground. Their childish voices and laughter would echo eerily down the concrete corridors, a sound so profoundly out of place in this tomb-like environment. They would play games in the narrow passageways, their energy a stark contrast to the shuffling, exhausted movements of the adults. The soldiers and staff, hardened by war and numb with despair, looked upon the children with a mixture of pity and wonder. They were a living, breathing reminder of the innocence that the regime had claimed to protect, now trapped in its dying heart. Imagine Magda in a simple dress, her elegant composure still intact, gathering her 6 children in their small room. She reads them stories, her voice calm and even. She leads them in songs, which they perform with childish enthusiasm for Uncle Hitler during his brief, increasingly rare visits to their quarters. He would watch them, a stooped and trembling old man, his eyes betraying a flicker of something unreadable, before he would retreat back to his own rooms and his maps of phantom armies. Life in the bunker was a study in contrasts. In one room, Hitler and his generals would be hunched over maps, shouting orders to commanders they could no longer contact. In another, Eva Braun, Hitler's long-term companion, would be trying to maintain a semblance of high life, changing her outfits several times a day and playing her favorite records. And in the Goebbels' quarters, 6 children slept in their bunk beds, oblivious to the fact that the ceiling above them was the garden of the Chancellery, a churned-up hellscape of mud and shell craters where the final battle for Berlin was raging. The atmosphere among the adults was a toxic cocktail of fanaticism, alcohol, and despair. Many of them, realizing the end was near, drank heavily, their days and nights blurring into a sleepless, anxious haze. Yet, the belief in a last-minute miracle, a wonder weapon, or a split between the Allies, persisted with a feverish intensity in the minds of the true believers, like Joseph Goebbels. He remained fanatically loyal, his energy focused on bolstering the Führer's spirits and documenting their final days for a posterity he believed would vindicate them. For Magda, the role was different. She was not a strategist or a soldier. She was the keeper of the flame of domestic German idealism, even as the world that ideal was meant to inhabit was being incinerated just a few yards above her head. She moved through this subterranean world with a quiet, practiced calm, speaking softly with the secretaries, like Traudl Junge, offering a serene, steady presence amidst the growing panic. But beneath this placid exterior, a terrible resolve was hardening. She had tied her fate and the fate of her children to this ideology and to these men. As the bunker became less of a fortress and more of a tomb, she began to quietly prepare for the final, unthinkable act that her loyalty would demand. The bedtime stories she told her children, in the cool, concrete-scented air, were a gentle prelude to the eternal silence she had chosen for them. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of a concrete box. Outside, the symphony of destruction reached its crescendo as the final desperate battle for Berlin raged street by street, house by house. But down in the Führer bunker, these apocalyptic sounds were filtered and transformed. They became a dull, percussive vibration felt through the floor, a constant, low-frequency tremor that served as a physical reminder of their entombment. The direct, terrifying roar of artillery was replaced by the relentless, monotonous hum of the ventilation system, a sound that became the very pulse of this subterranean world. It was the sound of recycled air, of borrowed time. Time itself had begun to dissolve. Without the sun or the moon to mark its passage, the rhythm of life became a disorganized, feverish dream. The harsh, unblinking glare of the electric lights was eternal, creating a perpetual, sterile noon. Sleep came in brief, exhausted snatches, often interrupted by shouting, by the clinking of glasses, or by the arrival of another frantic messenger from the surface with news of another street lost, another battalion annihilated. Days and nights bled into one another, measured not by the clock, but by a series of grim, ritualistic events. Hitler's twice-daily military conferences, where phantom armies were moved across maps. The meager, repetitive meals served on tin trays. And the slow, steady depletion of the bunker's supply of alcohol, a resource consumed with increasing desperation by many of the occupants. The air grew thick and heavy, a stale cocktail of damp concrete, sweat, stale cigarette smoke, and the cheap perfume worn by the secretaries in a defiant, final gesture of normalcy. It was the scent of fear, of too many human beings confined in too small a space for too long. For Magda Goebbels, however, the performance of order had to continue. While others succumbed to despair or drunken stupor, she seemed to draw on a deep, cold reservoir of resolve. Her personal world, and that of her children, would remain an island of meticulous discipline within the rising tide of chaos. Each morning, she would wake the children. In the cramped, damp room, she would ensure they washed their faces and brushed their hair. Their clothes, simple but immaculate, were laid out for them. Imagine her kneeling on the cold concrete floor, carefully tying the ribbons in her daughter's blonde hair, her movements steady and precise. Imagine her leading them in their morning songs, their innocent, high-pitched voices echoing for a moment in the narrow corridor, a sound so alien in that place of doom that it would cause hardened SS guards to pause and turn away. She was preserving the symbols of a perfect German family, polishing them to a high shine, even as the nation they were meant to symbolize was being utterly obliterated just a few feet above their heads. This curated innocence existed in jarring proximity to the adult's disintegration. Joseph Goebbels, for his part, did not succumb to drunken despair. He was energized by the apocalypse, working feverishly at a small desk, drafting proclamations, writing in his diary, and composing grandiose radio addresses that would likely never be broadcast. He was a man documenting the end of his own world, still trying to shape the narrative for a future he would not see, convinced that history would eventually see their downfall as a grand, Wagnerian tragedy. His fanaticism was a fire that burned brighter as the oxygen in their world ran out. And at the center of this dying solar system was Adolf Hitler. He was a ghost haunting his own tomb. The man who had mesmerized millions was now a stooped, shuffling figure, his left hand trembling uncontrollably. His days were spent in his small private quarters, staring at a portrait of Frederick the Great, or emerging for the military briefings where he would erupt in sputtering, impotent rages, accusing his generals of universal betrayal and incompetence. His belief in victory had finally shattered, replaced by a nihilistic determination to pull the entire world down with him. In the midst of this Götterdämmerung, a bizarre and macabre event took place. In the early hours of the 29th of April, with the sounds of Soviet machine gun fire now clearly audible from the Chancellery garden above, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. It was a pathetic, hurried ceremony performed in the bunker's small map room by a minor city official who had been pulled from a nearby Volkssturm unit. Magda and Joseph Goebbels served as the official witnesses. Imagine the scene. The small room, dominated by the huge map table, the handful of attendees, their faces pale and sleepless in the harsh electric light. Hitler in his usual uniform jacket, Eva in a black silk dress, a desperate attempt at glamour. Magda stood beside her husband, her expression serene and unreadable. She signed the marriage certificate as a witness, her handwriting as neat and controlled as ever. She was observing the final pathetic piece of theatre, a wedding ceremony conducted in a tomb, a union to be consummated only in death. It was the ultimate expression of the bunker's detachment from reality. Immediately following this ceremony, another ritual took place. Hitler retired to an adjoining room with his secretary, Traudl Junge, to dictate his final political testament and his personal will. This was the moment the unspoken became explicit. He confirmed his intention to commit suicide rather than suffer the humiliation of capture. He expelled his most powerful lieutenants, Himmler and Göring, from the party for their attempts to negotiate with the Allies, acts he saw as the ultimate betrayal. He laid out his final, venomous, self-pitying vision for Germany, blaming the war on international Jewry and absolving himself of all responsibility. For Magda, this was the final signal. Hitler's decision sanctified her own. Her path, which had been hardening into a certainty, was now irrevocably set. To her, loyalty was not a political strategy. It was a sacred pact, a quasi-religious vow. If the Führer, the man she saw as the very embodiment of the German ideal, was leaving the world, then her duty was to follow. And more than that, it was her duty to ensure that her children, these perfect specimens of the National Socialist future, did not have to live in the contaminated, dishonorable world that would come after. Her resolve became an almost tangible force. She spoke with Hannah Reich, the famous female test pilot who had daringly flown into the besieged city to see Hitler one last time. Magda, with a chilling calmness, spoke of her decision. She seemed to view it not as a tragedy, but as a logical, necessary conclusion. She tried to give Reich a vial of poison for her own use, a small act of solidarity in their shared nihilistic fate. Later, she sat with Traudl Junge, the young secretary who was overcome with fear and pity for the children. Magda explained her reasoning, her voice soft and devoid of emotion, as if discussing a household chore. God will understand me if I give them their deliverance myself, she said. She spoke of how the world after the Führer and after National Socialism would not be a world worth living in. She could not bear the thought of her children growing up to hear that their father was one of history's greatest criminals, to be exposed to the shame and the hatred that would inevitably follow. My children are too beautiful, too good for the world that is to come, she explained. In her mind, this was not murder. It was an act of ultimate maternal protection, a final, terrible act of love, shielding her children from a future she considered worse than death. The decision was made. All that remained was the method and the moment. The 30th of April, 1945. This was not just another day in the perpetual artificial twilight of the bunker. The frantic, chaotic energy of the preceding weeks, the desperate hope for a miracle, the furious, impotent rages, all of that began to subside, replaced by a new atmosphere. It was a feeling of profound and eerie finality, a deep, collective exhale of resignation. The end was no longer a dreadful possibility to be fought against. It was now an appointment to be kept. The bunker had ceased to be a command post and had become a waiting room for death. The day began with a semblance of the routine that had governed their subterranean lives. But every small act was now imbued with a heavy significance. Every glance exchanged between the occupants held the weight of an unspoken goodbye. Lunch was served around midday. Hitler, a man who had commanded the diets of millions, sat down for his last meal. It was a simple, almost ascetic plate of spaghetti with a light tomato sauce, prepared by his personal cook, Costanze Manziali. He ate quietly in the company of his two remaining secretaries, Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian. The conversation was stilted, minimal. The usual hum of the generator and the distant rhythmic pounding of Soviet artillery were the dominant sounds. It was a meal saturated with the knowledge of what was to come, a final mundane act before an event of world historical importance. Following the meal, the time came for the official farewell. The door to Hitler's private conference room opened, and he emerged, followed by his new wife, Eva Braun. A small, solemn group had been assembled in the passageway outside. The Goebbels family, the remaining generals, Martin Bormann, and the secretaries. They formed a quiet, nervous line, a funeral procession for people who were still alive. Imagine yourself standing in that narrow concrete corridor. The air is thick and still. Hitler moves slowly down the line, his face a grey, slack mask. The infamous, mesmerizing eyes are now dull and unfocused. His left arm hangs limply, the hand trembling violently. He shakes hands with each person. His grip is soft, his words barely audible murmurs. It is the slow, shuffling progress of a man already detaching himself from the world, from the people who had given their lives over to his vision. He reaches Magda Goebbels. For a moment, he pauses. He looks at this woman who had embodied his ideal of German womanhood, who had followed him with unwavering, fanatical devotion to the very end. Without a word, he reaches up to his own uniform jacket and unpins the small golden Nazi Party badge he had been awarded for being one of its first members. It was his most treasured personal possession, badge number 1. He presses it into her hand. This was more than a gift. It was a transfer of a sacred relic. It was Hitler's final acknowledgement of her supreme loyalty. For Magda, this was the ultimate validation, a holy sacrament conferred upon her by her Messiah at the moment of his departure. She accepted it with a quiet, reverent bow of her head, her face composed, her resolve now sealed with this final, terrible honor. She had been anointed as the high priestess of his cult at its very end. Eva Braun followed. She attempted a smile, a last performance of the charming hostess. She embraced the young Traudl Junge. "Please try to get out," she whispered. "Give my love to Bavaria." It was a moment of simple human sentiment, a stark contrast to the grim, ideological weight of the moment. Then the farewells were over. Hitler and Eva Braun retreated back into their private suite. A heavy steel door closed behind them, its latch clicking shut with a sound of profound finality. The remaining group stood for a moment in the corridor, suspended in a state of silent, anxious paralysis. The appointment was now being kept. The spell was broken as people began to disperse. Most of the senior officers and staff shuffled towards the bunker's canteen area, a small switchboard and communications room that had become the de facto social hub. An unspoken collective need to not be alone took hold. They began to drink, to smoke, to talk in low, nervous voices, anything to fill the suffocating silence, anything to distract from the reality of what was happening just a few rooms away. They turned up a gramophone, and dance music began to drift thinly down the concrete halls, a sound of grotesque and surreal cheerfulness. But Magda Goebbels did not join them. She had her own rituals to attend to. She retreated to the small room where her children were. They were playing, their voices a stream of innocent chatter, utterly oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Helga, the eldest, was perhaps reading. The younger ones might have been playing with the few simple toys they had, or perhaps with the puppies belonging to Hitler's dog Blondie, which had themselves been born into this concrete world. Imagine Magda sitting on the edge of a simple wooden bunk bed. The golden party pin is now fastened to her dress. She watches her children, her face a mask of calm composure. She may have played a simple game of cards with them, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She was insulating herself within the bubble of their innocence, drawing strength from their ignorance. Her mind was not in the smoky canteen with the desperate adults. It was here, in this room, methodically preparing for the next and final step of her own terrible plan. She was no longer waiting for a miracle. She was waiting for a sound. It came a short time later, a single sharp report. It was not exceptionally loud in the insulated confines of the bunker, but it was clear, definitive, and unmistakable. It sliced through the drone of the generator and the thin strains of the gramophone music. For a moment, all motion, all conversation in the canteen ceased. A deep, absolute silence fell, a silence more profound and terrifying than the noise it had replaced. After a few moments of hesitation, a small group, including Martin Bormann and Hitler's valet, Heinz Linger, moved cautiously towards the closed steel door. They waited, they listened. There was no other sound. After calling out and receiving no answer, Linger, using a key he possessed, unlocked the door and pushed it open. The scene inside was one of final, quiet stillness. The air was sharp, with the acrid, biting scent of burnt cordite from a discharged firearm. Hitler was slumped on the floral-patterned sofa, his head tilted to one side. Beside him sat Eva Braun, her body arranged as if she had simply drifted off to sleep. 2 pistols lay on the floor and the table. It was a tableau, not of violent struggle, but of methodical, planned exit. The news spread through the bunker, not as a shout, but as a series of urgent whispers. The Führer was dead. The central pillar of their entire universe had vanished. The grim, practiced procedures that had been prearranged now took over. The bodies were quickly and quietly wrapped in grey, woolen army blankets, concealing them from view. A small procession of SS guards carried the shrouded forms up the concrete stairs, out of the bunker, and into the desolate wasteland of the Reich Chancellery Garden. Above ground, the world was a vision of hell. A grey, smoke-choked sky pressed down on a lunar landscape of rubble and shell craters. The constant shrieking whistle of incoming Soviet artillery shells punctuated the air. The small group of men worked with frantic haste. They placed the 2 blanket-wrapped bodies into a shallow crater near the bunker's entrance. They retrieved several jerry cans of petrol from the Chancellery garages, a precious hoarded commodity. They drenched the bodies and the surrounding earth. One of them lit a rag and tossed it into the crater. For a moment, it sputtered. Then with a violent whoosh, the petrol ignited. A column of greasy black smoke billowed up towards the grey sky, carrying with it the final physical traces of Adolf Hitler and the woman he had married less than 48 hours before. The remaining men, Goebbels, Bormann, and a few others, stood back from the intense heat, raised their arms one last time in the party salute, a gesture of futile defiance against the backdrop of their total and absolute ruin. Down below, the news was received with a mixture of shock, grief, and a strange sense of release. But for Magda Goebbels, it was simply the closing of a door. The man to whom she had sworn her ultimate allegiance was gone. The world she had believed in had officially ceased to exist. Her purpose was now stripped down to its final, terrible essence. She remained in the room with her children, a figure of unnerving calm. The fire in the garden above was consuming the past. Now, she would turn her methodical attention to erasing the future. The fire in the Chancellery Garden, a crude and hurried pyre for a fallen dictator, had consumed itself. All that remained was a patch of blackened earth and the lingering foul stench of petrol, and something more profound, which mixed with the dust and cordite hanging in the Berlin air. Down in the bunker, a new reality had set in. The central sun around which their world had revolved was extinguished. For a brief, bizarre period of approximately 1 day, Joseph Goebbels held the title that had been his life's ultimate ambition. He was the Chancellor of Germany. It was a hollow, meaningless title. His chancellery was a concrete tomb, and his nation was a field of ruins, its last remnants being systematically crushed just a few yards above his head. The frenetic energy of the past few weeks, the desperate clinging to hope, evaporated, leaving behind a thick, heavy residue of pure despair. The atmosphere became lethargic, thick with the silence of resignation. The remaining occupants of the bunker now seemed to drift through the narrow corridors like spectres, their faces grey and gaunt in the perpetual, harsh light of the bare bulbs. Conversations dwindled to essential, whispered exchanges. The time for strategy, for debate, for fanaticism was over. All that was left was the methodical process of ending. For Magda Goebbels, this shift from chaos to quiet resolve brought with it a chilling clarity of purpose. The final act, which had existed in her mind as a terrible, abstract necessity, now moved into the foreground as a concrete series of tasks to be performed. Her movements remained unhurried, her expression a mask of serene composure. She had become a figure of almost supernatural calm amidst the emotional wreckage of those around her. The 1st of May, 1945. This would be the last day. The children, unaware of the momentous events of the previous afternoon, awoke to the same monotonous routine. They were washed, their hair was brushed, their simple clothes were straightened. They were given a small breakfast. They were, for all intents and purposes, living a day like any other in their strange, subterranean existence. Magda spent hours with them, her presence a constant, calming influence. She read them stories, her voice a soft, even monotone. She brought out a deck of cards and played simple games with them, her hands shuffling and dealing with a steady, practiced rhythm. To an outside observer, it would have looked like an image of profound maternal devotion under the most trying of circumstances. But it was a devotion twisted into a terrible, unrecognizable shape by years of ideological poison. She was spending these final precious hours with her children not to savor their life, but to prepare them for its end. She was meticulously maintaining their innocence, preserving their untroubled state of mind, so that they might drift into the eternal silence without fear or struggle. It was the ultimate, horrific extension of the protected, curated world she had always built for them. Sometime in the afternoon, she sat down to write one last letter. It was addressed to Harold Quant, her firstborn, her only child who would survive. He was, at that moment, a prisoner of war in an Allied camp in North Africa, utterly unaware of the drama unfolding in the heart of the fallen capital. Imagine her, sitting at a small wooden table in the cramped room, the golden party badge still pinned to her dress. The pen moved steadily across the paper, her handwriting elegant and controlled. "My beloved son," she began. The letter was not an apology. It was not a confession of doubt. It was a final testament of her unwavering belief. She wrote of the glorious idea that was dying, and of a world without Adolf Hitler and National Socialism that was not worth living in. She explained her decision to take the other children with her, framing it as an act of deliverance from a future of shame and dishonor. "The life that will come after the Führer," she wrote, "is not worth living." She sealed the letter, entrusting it to one of the few people who still planned to attempt an escape, a final message sent out from the tomb to the world of the living. As evening began to fall, an abstract concept in this sunless world, marked only by the changing of guards and the serving of the final meal, the preparations entered their last stage. Magda gathered the 6 children together. Helga, 12 years old, perceptive and intelligent. Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, the only boy. Holdine, 7, Hedwig, 6, and little Heidrun, just 4 years old. She told them it was time for bed. They would have been accustomed to the routine, but this time there was a slight variation. She told them that because the noise of the battle outside was so loud, and because they would soon have to make a long journey, they needed to have a special medicine to help them sleep very, very deeply. She presented it as a treat, perhaps mixing it into cups of hot chocolate or sweetened coffee. The children, trusting their mother implicitly, would have taken it without question. She led them to their beds, a series of simple wooden bunks stacked against the damp concrete walls. She helped them undress and put on their nightgowns. She tucked them in, one by one, smoothing their blankets, whispering a soft goodnight to each. The drink she had given them contained a powerful sedative. Slowly, peacefully, one by one, the children drifted off into a deep, untroubled sleep. The sound of their soft, even breathing filled the small room, a gentle rhythm of life in the heart of death. For a time, Magda simply sat in the quiet room, watching her sleeping children. The harsh electric light cast long shadows on the walls. She was waiting for the sedative to take its full effect, ensuring they were lost to all awareness. Her composure during this period was, according to the few witnesses who glimpsed her, unnerving. It was the calm of a surgeon before a difficult operation, the focus of a craftsman completing a final, intricate piece of work. When she was certain the moment was right, she summoned Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, one of Hitler's personal physicians who had remained in the bunker. He was a tall, imposing man, a loyal SS officer who had agreed to assist in the final act. What happened next was a procedure of cold, clinical efficiency. The historical record, based on post-mortem examinations and later testimony, suggests that while the children were in their deep, sedated sleep, a cyanide capsule was crushed in each of their mouths. This is the moment where words fail, where the quiet, detached tone of our narrative must hold firmest to avoid the abyss of sensationalism. It was not an act of rage or passion. It was a quiet, methodical procedure, a final, terrible tucking in. It was the quiet closing of 6 young lives, carried out by their own mother, who saw it not as murder, but as a final sacred duty. The gentle, rhythmic breathing in the room ceased. The silence that followed was absolute. Her work was done. The monument to her ideology was complete. Magda Goebbels emerged from the room, her face pale but her expression still one of chilling serenity. She calmly announced to the few remaining people in the passageway, "It is finished." Now, only her own end remained. She and Joseph Goebbels, the man who had given her the purpose she so desperately craved, prepared for their final ascent. They walked together, side by side, through the quiet, tomb-like corridors of the bunker. They didn't look back. They ascended the concrete stairs that led up to the Chancellery garden, the same stairs that Hitler's body had been carried up the day before. An SS orderly who witnessed their departure later said they were calm, walking slowly, as if taking a stroll. They emerged into the twilight of a dying city. The air was cold and filled with the stench of smoke and decay. The shelling had momentarily subsided, creating an eerie lull. They stood together near the bunker's emergency exit. Joseph Goebbels carried a pistol, according to a pre-arranged plan with his SS adjutant. Once they were in position, the adjutant was to fire 2 shots into their bodies after they had taken their own lives, to ensure their death. The exact sequence of events is unclear, whether Joseph Goebbels shot his wife and then himself, or they took cyanide simultaneously, is lost to the chaos of those final moments. But 2 shots rang out in the desolate garden, and then silence. Their bodies were left where they fell. There was no one left with the will or the means to give them the pagan pyre that Hitler had received. They were simply left to the encroaching darkness. 2 days later, on the 2nd of May, the first Soviet soldiers fought their way into the Reich Chancellery complex. They were battle-hardened men, accustomed to the horrors of war. But nothing could have prepared them for the bizarre subterranean world they were about to discover. They broke down the locked steel doors and entered the bunker. Imagine their perspective. They moved cautiously through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They found a world frozen in time, half-eaten meals on tables, scattered papers and empty bottles, the gramophone sitting silently in the canteen. In the main conference room, the vast map of Europe was still spread out, a testament to a madman's fantasy. Then they found the small room in the Vorbunker. They opened the door and their flashlights cut through the darkness. The scene inside stopped them cold. 6 small beds, 6 children. They looked at first glance as if they were peacefully asleep. Each was tucked neatly into their bed, their blonde hair fanned out on their pillows. The eldest girl, Helga, showed some bruising on her face, a silent testament to a possible, final, brief struggle against the inevitable. But the others looked serene. It was a scene of such profound and quiet horror that it deeply shook even these hardened soldiers. It was not a scene of battle, but of ritual, a perfectly preserved, horrific tableau of ideology's ultimate conclusion. The story, in time, would be pieced together. The bodies in the garden were identified. Magda's final letter to Harold eventually reached him in his POW camp, a devastating message from a dead world. He would go on to live a quiet life, haunted by his family's legacy, becoming a successful industrialist himself, but never escaping the shadow of the name Goebbels. The Quandt fortune, of which he was a major heir, would continue to grow, its complex history forever entangled with the dark history of the Third Reich. And so, the life of Magda Goebbels, a life that began in a world of quiet bourgeois aspiration, ended in an act of terrible ideological purity. It was a journey from a desire for elegance and status to a belief system so absolute that it demanded the sacrifice of everything, even the most fundamental human instinct, a mother's desire to protect her children's lives. Her story serves as a slow, haunting reflection on how the search for purpose, when fused with a monstrous ideology and insulated by immense privilege, can lead to an abyss from which there is no return. It is a quiet, dark current in the river of history, a chilling lullaby of ambition, conviction, and the most devastating of consequences.